My husband vanished for 6 long days and finally walked back in with a smug grin saying, "You should be thankful I even came home." I looked at him calmly and replied, "You're right, thank you. But this isn't your home anymore." Then I handed him the yellow envelope and watched every trace of color drain from his face. "You should be grateful I even came home." Silas stood in our hallway after 6 days of silence, looking refreshed and radiant, expecting gratitude for returning from the affair I'd already documented. He thought I was still the accommodating wife who'd ignore cologne I didn't buy and lies about conferences that didn't exist. He was wrong. But to understand how catastrophically wrong he was, I need to take you back 3 months to when I still believed in the marriage I thought we had. Back to when I was still Eliza Brennan who made excuses for suspicious behavior and convinced herself that trust meant not asking uncomfortable questions. Back to before I discovered that the foundation of 12 years together had been quietly dissolving while I was too busy maintaining appearances to notice the cracks. Before we continue, I want to thank you for being here and sharing these stories of resilience and strategic strength. If you believe that betrayal deserves accountability and that protecting yourself matters, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more people who need to hear this. Now let's see how this unfolds. My name is Eliza Brennan, and I'm a marketing consultant in Chicago specializing in brand strategy for mid-sized firms navigating digital transformation. For 7 years I'd been married to Silas Montgomery, an architect at Morrison & Associates, one of the city's respected design firms. Before marriage, we'd dated for 5 years, which meant we'd spent 12 years total building what I'd believed was an unshakable partnership. Long enough to think I knew someone completely. Long enough to be devastatingly wrong. We'd met at a community theater production of Our Town, where I was managing publicity and he was building sets. I remembered watching him work during rehearsals, the careful precision with which he measured lumber and assembled the skeletal structures that would become the play's temporary world. He'd approached me during a break, sawdust still clinging to his shirt, and asked if I wanted coffee. We'd talked for 3 hours at a diner 2 blocks from the theater, sketching dreams and future plans on paper napkins that we'd both saved for months afterward like they were precious artifacts marking the beginning of something significant. Those early years had been defined by beautiful struggle. Silas was establishing himself as an architect in a brutally competitive market, taking projects that paid poorly but built his portfolio and reputation. I was climbing from junior consultant to senior strategist, working 16-hour days to prove myself indispensable to clients who initially questioned whether someone my age could deliver strategic value. We'd survived on takeout food and shared ambition, celebrating small victories with champagne we couldn't quite afford and intimate dinners in our tiny apartment where the kitchen and living room occupied the same 12-foot space. My mother had disapproved initially, calling Silas's career path unstable and questioning whether an architect could provide the security she'd envisioned for my future. We'd proven her wrong together, or so I'd believed at the time. By the time we married, we'd both achieved versions of success that felt hard-earned and deeply shared. Silas had landed his position at Morrison & Associates where he'd eventually advanced to senior designer. My consulting practice had grown until I was pulling 6-figure contracts and turning down projects because my schedule couldn't accommodate additional clients. We'd moved into a 2-bedroom condominium with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a space we'd furnished gradually with pieces that represented our combined aesthetic. Not luxurious by any means, but comfortable and undeniably ours. The condominium had been purchased primarily with inheritance money I'd received from my grandmother, a detail that would later prove legally significant in ways I couldn't have anticipated during those optimistic early years. Our life together had developed rhythms that felt like the architecture of genuine partnership. Saturday mornings were reserved for the farmers market near Lincoln Park, where Silas would select produce with the same careful attention he applied to building materials while I managed our reusable bags and provided running commentary about overpriced organic kale. Friday nights meant movie nights with takeout from the Thai restaurant on the corner, his choice of film alternating with mine in a democratic system we'd maintained for years. We hosted dinner parties where friends regularly called us the couple that makes marriage look easy, a compliment I'd accepted with pride that now felt like evidence of my own willful blindness. I'd treasured the small intimacies most. The way Silas would read passages from architecture journals aloud while I worked on client presentations at the dining table, sharing interesting design concepts like they were treasures he wanted me to appreciate. Our accumulated inside jokes and references that made us feel like we spoke a private language only we understood. The comfortable silence of two people who didn't require constant conversation to feel connected. Those details had comprised my evidence that our marriage was solid, functional, maybe even enviable to others who struggled with partnership dynamics. The changes had begun approximately 3 months before that devastating doorway confrontation. Subtle at first, easy to rationalize individually, but forming a pattern I'd actively chosen not to recognize as significant until the evidence became impossible to ignore. Silas started waking earlier than usual, his alarm suddenly set for 5:30 instead of the 6:15 he'd maintained for our entire relationship. He'd spend extended periods in the bathroom with the door locked, emerging already dressed and smelling of cologne I absolutely didn't recognize. The scent was expensive, distinctive, nothing remotely similar to the drugstore aftershave he'd worn throughout our years together. When I'd asked about it casually one morning, he'd mentioned something vague about receiving a sample at a client meeting, a detail too minor to challenge directly but notable enough to lodge in my memory. His phone behavior shifted dramatically during this period. The device that used to sit casually on countertops and nightstands became permanently attached to his person, always positioned face down, always within immediate arm's reach. When I'd enter a room where he was texting or scrolling, he'd shift the screen away with movements that were just slightly too quick, just slightly too deliberate to be unconscious. His laptop acquired new password protections seemingly overnight. Websites that used to load automatically now required authentication. Small digital fortifications that individually meant nothing but collectively suggested someone methodically building walls. Financial irregularities began appearing in our joint account statements. Cash withdrawals occurred every Thursday without exception, always exactly $200, amounts carefully calibrated to avoid triggering any fraud alerts but consistent enough to establish an unmistakable pattern once I started paying attention. Charges appeared for restaurants we'd never visited together, always on weeknights when he claimed to be working late on demanding projects. When I'd asked about his extended hours at the office, his explanations grew progressively shorter and noticeably more defensive in tone. "It's a demanding project, Eliza. You understand how deadlines work," he'd say with an edge of irritation that felt designed to discourage further questions. I did understand deadlines intimately. They were central to my own consulting work. But deadlines in my experience didn't typically require new cologne, secretive phone behavior, or regular cash withdrawals that formed suspicious patterns. My best friend Claire had noticed my deterioration before I'd fully admitted the problem to myself. During our monthly coffee meetup at our usual spot near Millennium Park, she'd studied me with the professional assessment of someone who spent her entire career documenting the dissolution of relationships. Claire was a divorce attorney, one of the most successful in Chicago, and someone I'd known since our college years who understood me well enough to recognize when something fundamental had shifted in my life. "You look completely exhausted," she'd said, not as casual observation but as clinical diagnosis that demanded explanation. "What's actually happening with you?" I'd found myself confessing details I hadn't consciously planned to share with anyone. Silas's growing emotional distance. The unexplained schedule changes. The cologne that smelled like expensive secrets. The phone guarding that suggested he was protecting information he didn't want me to access. The mounting sense that I was living with someone who remained physically present but had emotionally relocated to somewhere I wasn't invited to follow. Claire had listened without visible judgment, but I'd seen the recognition flash across her expression, the professional acknowledgement of a behavioral pattern she'd witnessed countless times in her legal practice. "Eliza, I've encountered this exact combination of behaviors at least 1,000 times professionally," she'd said carefully, her tone balanced precisely between personal friendship and professional observation. "I'm not definitively stating that Silas is having an affair, but I need you to understand that what you're describing represents textbook warning signs. Trust your instincts on this. They're usually accurate, and most people actually know the truth long before they're psychologically ready to consciously admit it to themselves." She hadn't pushed further after planting that seed. Claire understood intuitively that I needed to arrive at the conclusion independently rather than having it imposed from external sources. But that night, lying beside Silas as he scrolled through his phone with his back deliberately turned toward me, I'd felt something crack audibly inside my chest. Not my heart breaking exactly, but rather the foundation of my denial fracturing under the accumulated weight of evidence I could no longer successfully rationalize away. I'd been performing ignorance, actively protecting myself from a truth I'd already half discovered, and Claire's carefully chosen words had stripped away the last protective layer of willful blindness I'd been maintaining. The definitive confirmation arrived on a Tuesday evening when Silas made his first significant operational mistake. He left his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he showered, singing a John Mayer song I'd never once heard him play during our entire relationship. The screen glowed with his email inbox, and a notification appeared that fundamentally reorganized my understanding of reality. Last night was incredible. He's clueless. Can't wait for next week. The sender's name was Jennifer Caldwell, someone Silas had mentioned perhaps a dozen times over 3 years as his project manager at Morrison & Associates. Competent, he'd always said. Professional. Strictly business, nothing more. My hands trembled as I read the preview text repeatedly, hoping desperately that I'd somehow misunderstood the plain meaning of the words displayed before me, knowing absolutely that I hadn't. I didn't open the full email to read additional details. I didn't need to see more. Those 2 sentences contained everything necessary to understand what had been happening. My husband was having an affair. The woman involved knew about my existence and found my ignorance amusing enough to reference directly. They were actively planning future encounters with the casual comfort of an established pattern. I closed the laptop exactly as I'd found it, maintaining the precise angle and screen position. My mind felt eerily calm despite my heart racing with adrenaline. I returned to the kitchen counter where I'd been chopping vegetables for the stir-fry we'd planned to share, picked up the knife I'd set down moments earlier, and resumed the mechanical task. Each slice of the blade against the cutting board marked the ending of one version of my life and the beginning of something I couldn't yet fully envision. When Silas emerged from the bathroom wearing fresh clothes and that now identifiable cologne, he kissed my cheek with practiced affection that felt completely hollow. The gesture seemed rehearsed, performative, a routine maintained strictly for appearances rather than genuine emotional connection. He asked about my day using the tone of someone fulfilling an obligation. I responded with surface details about a client presentation, my voice remaining steady despite the chaos actively reorganizing itself inside my chest. We sat down to dinner together as we had countless evenings before. I watched him eat. I watched him scroll through his phone between bites with casual entitlement. I watched him exist in our supposedly shared space while clearly thinking about someone else, somewhere else, planning encounters that excluded and betrayed me. I smiled appropriately. I asked follow-up questions about his project deadlines that I now understood were partially fictional. I maintained the complete performance of normalcy while understanding with devastating clarity that I was sitting directly across from a stranger who merely happened to wear my husband's familiar face. The foundation hadn't just developed cracks. It had dissolved entirely beneath me, and I was only beginning to comprehend the full scope of what that collapse actually meant for everything I'd built my adult life around. The morning after discovering that email, I woke at 5 and couldn't fall back asleep. Silas was still breathing deeply beside me, oblivious to the fact that the woman lying next to him had stopped being his wife in any meaningful sense and had become something closer to an investigator documenting a crime scene. I slipped out of bed quietly, made coffee I couldn't taste, and sat in my car outside a coffee shop 3 blocks from my office at 7 in the morning, staring at Claire's contact information on my phone screen. My pride wrestled violently with my survival instinct. Asking my best friend for divorce attorney recommendations felt like publicly announcing my marriage's death certificate, transforming private suspicion into irreversible reality. Once I made this call, there would be no pretending I'd misunderstood that email or that some innocent explanation existed for cologne and Thursday night hotel charges. This call would make the betrayal official, would force me to stop performing the role of trusting wife and start preparing for the role of ex-wife. But the alternative terrified me more. Confronting Silas without preparation, letting raw emotion drive my strategy, felt like walking into battle completely unarmed while my opponent had been planning his campaign for months. I pressed call before I could change my mind. Claire answered on the second ring, her voice warm with the assumption this was a normal friendly check-in. Eliza, hey. Everything okay? I need a referral, I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. For myself. A divorce attorney. The silence on the other end lasted perhaps 3 seconds but felt substantially longer. When Claire spoke again, her tone had shifted entirely from personal friend to seasoned professional who'd heard this exact sentence from desperate women countless times before. Vivian Torres, she said without hesitation, without questions I wasn't ready to answer, without platitudes about marriage counseling or working things out. She's brilliant, absolutely thorough, and she doesn't lose cases. I'll text you her number right now. 20 minutes later, I was scheduling a consultation during a lunch break that Silas would assume I'd spent at my usual Thursday yoga class. The receptionist offered me an appointment for the following week. I asked if anything was available sooner. She found a cancellation for that same afternoon at 2. Vivian Torres's office occupied the 43rd floor of a building overlooking Lake Michigan, all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that made the city look both magnificent and indifferent to individual human suffering. Vivian herself was a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-50s with silver hair cut in a precise bob and a no-nonsense demeanor that somehow made me feel safer despite discussing the collapse of my marriage with a complete stranger. She listened to my story without visible reaction, taking occasional notes on a legal pad while I described the email, the cologne, the Thursday night pattern, the growing distance. When I finished, she set down her pen and leaned forward slightly. Eliza, I'm going to be extremely direct because that's what you need right now. You have exactly 2 options. React emotionally immediately and lose significant leverage, or gather evidence methodically over the next several weeks and control the outcome completely. Which option do you want? The second one, I said without hesitation. Good, Vivian replied. Then we need to talk about documentation, financial protection, and strategic timing. This is going to feel uncomfortable. You're going to feel like you're doing something wrong by investigating your own husband. You're not. You're protecting yourself from someone who's already demonstrated that your well-being isn't his priority. Over the next 3 weeks, I transformed into someone I barely recognized in the mirror. I became a detective in my own marriage, a woman who photographed credit card statements when Silas left them on the kitchen counter, who documented the patterns of his text message behavior, who accessed our family phone plan online to track his location during his supposed late nights at the office. The process felt dirty in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd spent 12 years building trust with this man, and now I was systematically dismantling that trust from the inside while pretending nothing had changed. But Vivian's words echoed constantly during moments when guilt threatened to derail my resolve. Documentation is protection. You're not violating his privacy. You're gathering evidence of how he violated your partnership. The credit card statements revealed a pattern that made my stomach turn. Silas had been visiting the Lakeside Boutique Hotel every Thursday night for the past 4 months, charging rooms to our joint credit card at $175 per visit. He was literally using our shared money to fund his affair, the financial equivalent of making me pay for my own betrayal. I photographed every statement, highlighted every charge, created a spreadsheet that tracked dates and amounts with color-coded precision. The cash withdrawals formed their own damning pattern. Every Wednesday without fail, Silas withdrew exactly $200 from our joint account at an ATM near his office. The amounts were carefully calibrated to avoid triggering any fraud alerts but consistent enough to clearly fund a parallel life I wasn't supposed to know existed. Dinner receipts appeared for restaurants we'd never visited together. Always on Thursday evenings, always for 2 people, always charged to our joint card before the hotel room. I created a master spreadsheet that would have impressed my most detail-oriented clients. Color-coded rows tracked every lie he'd told about late meetings, every Thursday he'd claimed to work late on demanding projects, every expense that couldn't be explained by legitimate architectural work. Dates, amounts, locations, all meticulously documented. I was building a legal case against the man I'd promised to love forever. And the irony wasn't lost on me that I was applying the same strategic thinking to ending my marriage that I applied to building brands for corporate clients. The hardest part wasn't the investigation itself. The hardest part was maintaining absolute normalcy while conducting it. I cooked dinners and asked about his day. I laughed at his jokes even though they no longer felt funny. I kissed him goodbye in the mornings and welcomed him home in the evenings, all while knowing that every word out of his mouth carried lies I was systematically cataloging for future use. My sister Nina noticed something was wrong during our weekly phone call about 2 weeks into my investigation. Nina lived in Milwaukee, worked as a graphic designer, and possessed exactly zero ability to hide her emotions or moderate her reactions. "You sound completely weird," she said bluntly halfway through our conversation. What's actually wrong? I hesitated, knowing that telling Nina would open a door I couldn't close. But the weight of carrying this alone had become unsustainable, and I needed someone in my family to know the truth even if I wasn't ready for broader exposure. The confession poured out in a flood I couldn't control. The email. The cologne. The hotel charges. The evidence I'd been gathering. Nina's response was immediate and entirely predictable. I'm going to kill him, she said, her voice rising with genuine rage. I'm literally going to drive to Chicago right now and set his office on fire. Or maybe just his car. Does he still park in that garage on State Street? Nina, no, I said firmly, recognizing the dangerous edge in her voice. You can't do anything. If you confront him or cause any kind of scene, you'll completely ruin my legal strategy. Over the following days, Nina called repeatedly, each conversation escalating in intensity. She wanted to confront Silas directly. She wanted to expose him publicly on social media. She wanted to accidentally encounter him and Jennifer somewhere with her camera phone ready. Her protective rage was cathartic to witness but terrifying to manage. You need to promise me you'll let me handle this my way, I insisted during one particularly heated conversation. Vivian has a strategy. If you interfere, you could actually hurt my case. Nina agreed reluctantly, but I could hear the barely restrained fury in her voice. The situation became more complicated when she mentioned telling our mother Eleanor, a traditional woman who'd always adored Silas and believed strongly in the sanctity of marriage vows. Mom needs to know what he's doing to you, Nina argued. She deserves to understand why her son-in-law is a lying piece of. No, I interrupted. Mom can't know yet. She'll try to fix it. She'll want me to go to counseling or give him another chance or pray about it. I can't deal with that right now. Nina promised silence, but I heard the difficulty of that promise in her voice. My sister had never been good at keeping secrets, especially ones that made her angry. The breakthrough in my investigation came when Vivian recommended a private investigator named Marcus Webb. Marcus was a former Chicago police detective who'd transitioned into private investigation work specializing in marital cases. He was expensive, requiring $2,000 upfront, but Vivian promised he was worth every cent. He'll get you photographs, comprehensive documentation, behavioral patterns, everything you'll need for settlement negotiations, she explained. This isn't about punishing your husband. It's about ensuring you have leverage. Marcus worked for exactly 2 weeks, following Silas during his supposed late nights and weekend site visits. When he delivered his report, professionally bound with tabs separating different categories of evidence, I had to sit down before opening it. The photographs were devastating in their casual intimacy. Silas and Jennifer walking hand in hand along a beach I didn't recognize. Sharing dinner at a restaurant with wine glasses and candlelight. Kissing in a parking lot with the comfortable ease of an established couple rather than the nervous excitement of a new affair. Every image was time-stamped and geotagged, creating an irrefutable timeline that matched exactly with the dates Silas had claimed to be working late or visiting project sites. But Marcus's report contained information beyond the affair itself. He discovered that Silas had been renting a lakeside cabin 40 minutes outside Chicago for the past 6 months. The rental agreement was in his name, paid with our joint credit card, a romantic getaway property he'd been using for extended encounters I'd known nothing about. The financial analysis Marcus included hit hardest. He'd calculated that Silas had spent approximately $12,000 of our joint savings on this affair over the past 6 months. Hotel rooms, restaurant dinners, the cabin rental, gifts that Jennifer received while I received nothing. Our shared money funding his betrayal. Marcus looked at me across his desk with an expression that mixed professional detachment with genuine sympathy. Mrs. Montgomery, your husband isn't just cheating, he said quietly. He's actively stealing from your shared future to fund it. That matters legally. That changes the calculation significantly. I drove home that evening with Marcus's report in my bag and a clarity I hadn't possessed before. This wasn't just an affair born from temporary dissatisfaction or midlife crisis. This was calculated, sustained, financially significant betrayal. Silas had been building a parallel life while allowing me to subsidize both his legitimate existence and his secret one. That night at dinner, I watched him eat the pasta I'd prepared and felt absolutely nothing. No love, no anger, just cold assessment of someone who'd proven himself unworthy of either emotion. The Friday morning Silas left arrived with deceptive normalcy. He emerged from the bedroom at his usual time, dressed in business casual attire with his small rolling suitcase already packed and waiting by the door. He approached me in the kitchen where I was preparing coffee and kissed my forehead with the same practiced affection he'd displayed for months, a gesture that now felt entirely mechanical. "Conference in Minneapolis this weekend," he announced, his tone carrying the casual confidence of someone who'd rehearsed this lie until it sounded natural. "Probably back Sunday evening, maybe Monday morning at the latest. Big potential client presentation. Can't miss this opportunity." I turned to face him, arranging my expression into what I hoped resembled supportive concern rather than the cold assessment I actually felt. "Good luck with the presentation," I said, forcing warmth into my voice. "I'll miss you." The words tasted like ash in my mouth, bitter and false, but I delivered them with the same performance quality he'd been demonstrating for months. He smiled, squeezed my hand briefly, grabbed his suitcase and walked out the door. Through the kitchen window, I watched his car exit our building's parking garage and disappear into morning traffic. The moment his vehicle was out of sight, I picked up my phone and called Vivian. She answered immediately despite the early hour. "He's gone," I said without preamble. "Told me he's attending a conference in Minneapolis. Back Sunday or Monday." "Verify it," Vivian responded instantly, her tone all business. "Call his office. Confirm whether the conference actually exists." I pulled up the main number for Morrison & Associates, the architectural firm where Silas had worked for the past 5 years. The HR coordinator answered on the third ring with professional cheerfulness. "Hi, this is Eliza Montgomery," I said, manufacturing concerned confusion in my voice. "I'm trying to reach my husband Silas, who's at your Minneapolis conference this weekend, but I've completely forgotten which hotel you're using. Can you help me with that information?" The pause on the other end lasted just long enough to confirm what I already suspected. When the coordinator spoke again, her tone carried genuine confusion rather than professional discretion. "Mrs. Montgomery, I'm sorry, but we don't have any conferences scheduled anywhere this quarter. Our next company event isn't until the spring symposium in March. Are you certain about the location and dates?" I thanked her politely, maintained my composed tone despite the confirmation burning through my chest, and ended the call. Silas hadn't gone to Minneapolis for any legitimate business purpose. He'd gone wherever Jennifer was waiting, probably to that lakeside cabin Marcus had documented, and he'd constructed this elaborate lie with such practiced ease that it was absolutely clear this wasn't his first fictional conference. Sunday arrived and passed with complete silence, broken only by a single text message that appeared on my phone at 9 in the evening. Extended. Don't wait up. No apology for the change in plans. No explanation for why a weekend conference had suddenly expanded into something longer. Just casual dismissal delivered in 6 words that assumed I'd accept whatever narrative he chose to provide. I stared at that message for several minutes, feeling something shift fundamentally inside me. The abandonment I might have felt during earlier stages of our relationship had transformed into something colder and infinitely more dangerous to him. Strategic resolve. Monday morning, I began dismantling our shared life with surgical precision. The locks changed first. I contacted a 24-hour locksmith service and had them install completely new mechanisms on our condominium door by noon. The lease was solely in my name, something I'd established 3 years earlier when we'd moved into this building using inheritance money from my grandmother. That detail, which had seemed irrelevant during happier times when we'd believed our partnership was permanent, now became crucial legal protection. I contacted our building management office and updated the authorized occupant list, formally removing Silas Montgomery from any access rights to the property. The property manager expressed mild surprise but processed the change without requiring extensive explanation. Building policy allowed leaseholders to modify access privileges at their discretion. Tuesday, I addressed our financial entanglement. I contacted our credit card companies and canceled the cards attached to our joint account, timing the cancellations carefully to ensure any charges Silas might attempt during his absence would be declined. I opened a new checking account at an entirely different financial institution and redirected my consulting income, which had been funding the majority of our joint expenses for the past 2 years. Every transfer was documented meticulously with notes explaining that I was protecting marital assets from further dissipation due to suspected misconduct. Wednesday brought the emotionally complex task of packing his belongings. I moved through our condominium methodically, gathering his clothing from the closet we'd shared, his toiletries from the bathroom, his architecture books from the shelves he'd installed himself 3 years ago. His collection of design journals, his drafting tools, his framed photographs from projects he'd completed, all of it went into boxes I stacked in the guest room with the systematic efficiency of someone cataloging artifacts for permanent storage. Each item I packed carried memories that wanted to surface. The shirt he'd worn on our anniversary trip to Michigan. The watch I'd given him for his birthday 2 years ago. The sketchbook where he'd drawn preliminary concepts for projects while we'd sat together on lazy Sunday mornings. I forced myself to treat these objects as evidence of a life that had already ended rather than remnants of something worth grieving. Emotion was a luxury I couldn't afford during these critical 72 hours. The physical dismantling felt both devastating and strangely empowering. I was actively choosing my response rather than passively accepting whatever narrative Silas would eventually present upon his return. 12 years of accumulated partnership compressed into boxes and policy changes, the architecture of our shared existence systematically deconstructed while he was presumably building intimate memories with someone else. Marcus called Wednesday afternoon, day 5 of Silas's unexplained absence, with an update delivered in his characteristically direct manner. "I have what you need," he said simply. "Can you meet?" We arranged to meet at a coffee shop in a neighborhood far from anywhere I typically frequented, reducing any chance of encountering someone who might recognize me and ask uncomfortable questions I wasn't prepared to answer publicly. Marcus arrived carrying a manila envelope and a USB drive, both of which he placed on the table between us with the solemnity of someone delivering crucial evidence in a criminal investigation. The printed photographs he spread before me showed Silas and Jennifer at what I now recognized as the lakeside cabin from his earlier surveillance reports. These images were different from the previous documentation, more intimate and somehow more damaging in their casual domesticity. They were cooking together in the cabin's small kitchen, Jennifer laughing at something while Silas stood behind her with his arms around her waist. They were sitting on the deck with wine glasses catching sunset light, their body language displaying the comfortable ease of an established couple rather than the nervous excitement of a new affair. One photograph in particular struck me with physical force. Silas and Jennifer at a small restaurant in the nearby town, sitting across from each other at a corner table. Silas wore the new navy jacket I'd noticed hanging in our closet last month, something I'd assumed he'd purchased for work presentations. Jennifer wore a delicate silver necklace that caught the light in ways that suggested it was expensive, possibly a gift funded by money from our joint accounts. Marcus had also captured them loading grocery bags into Silas's car, ordinary domestic activities that looked exactly like a couple on vacation managing the practical details of their temporary shared life. The ordinariness of it somehow made the betrayal more complete. "They're not hiding," Marcus observed, watching my face process the images. "They're comfortable, established, not taking particular precautions. This isn't new behavior for them. This is routine." He handed me the cabin's rental agreement, which he'd somehow managed to obtain through methods he declined to specify. Silas had signed it using his real name and paid the deposit with our joint credit card. The arrogance was breathtaking. He'd literally charged his affair accommodations to our shared account, making me an unwitting financial participant in my own betrayal. Thursday evening, with Silas entering his 6th consecutive day of unexplained absence, I sat at our dining room table with documents spread before me like battle plans. Vivian was on speakerphone, guiding me through the assembly of what she called the accountability package. We compiled everything into a single yellow legal envelope. The divorce petition Vivian had filed that morning with the county clerk. Photographic evidence from Marcus with dates, locations and activities carefully annotated. Credit card statements with highlighter marking every affair-related expense. Bank records documenting my asset protection transfers accompanied by detailed notes explaining the legal justification for each action. A formal cease and desist letter restricting Silas's access to marital accounts. The building management letter confirming his removal from our condominium's authorized occupant list. Vivian had also prepared a comprehensive financial analysis calculating that Silas had dissipated approximately $12,000 of marital funds on this affair over 6 months. Hotel charges, restaurant bills, the cabin rental, gifts, all itemized with the precision of a forensic audit. This documentation would become central to property division arguments. "This is your insurance policy," Vivian explained, her voice carrying professional satisfaction. "When he returns, and he absolutely will return because men like this always assume they can manage multiple realities indefinitely, you hand him this envelope. Don't argue. Don't explain. Don't engage emotionally. Just hand it to him and watch his understanding of the situation reset completely in real time." I sealed the yellow envelope and placed it precisely in the center of our coffee table, positioned where it would be immediately visible to anyone entering the condominium. It sat there like a landmine waiting to be triggered, like a bomb with a timer set to detonate the moment Silas walked through the door he no longer had keys to access. That night I slept better than I had in months. Not from happiness or satisfaction, but from the profound relief of knowing I'd converted pain into strategy and grief into protection. I'd spent 6 days building consequences while Silas had spent 6 days believing consequences didn't apply to him. Friday evening arrived with the weight of inevitability. I'd spent the day working from home, attempting to focus on client presentations while my attention kept drifting to the yellow envelope positioned precisely in the center of the coffee table. Around 6 o'clock, I heard the distinctive sound of a key attempting to turn in the lock that no longer recognized it. The metallic scraping continued for several seconds, confusion evident in the increasingly forceful attempts. Then silence. 30 seconds later my phone buzzed with an incoming text message. "I'm outside. Lock isn't working." I stood slowly, picked up the yellow envelope and walked toward the door with measured steps. Through the peephole, I observed Silas standing in the hallway with his small duffel bag, looking nothing like a man who'd just spent 6 days doing something worthy of guilt or shame. His hair was freshly cut, styled differently than usual. He wore a charcoal gray sweater I'd never seen before, paired with jeans that also appeared new. His entire appearance suggested someone returning from a rejuvenating vacation rather than an extended deception. I took a deliberate breath, steadied my hands around the envelope and opened the door. The sight of him standing there, looking so utterly comfortable and untroubled, nearly fractured the composure I'd been carefully constructing for this exact moment. Not because I missed him or felt residual affection, but because the complete absence of guilt on his face confirmed everything I'd come to understand about the person he'd become. Or perhaps had always been beneath the performance I'd mistaken for genuine partnership. His expression registered mild annoyance rather than contrition, as though the malfunctioning lock represented the primary inconvenience of his evening. His eyes met mine with the casual entitlement of someone who'd never seriously considered that actions might generate consequences. Then he spoke the words that would permanently crystallize my understanding of how completely our realities had diverged. "You should be thankful I even came home. Honestly, Eliza, after the week I've had, walking back in here feels like a sacrifice." The audacity momentarily stole my ability to respond. He'd vanished for 6 consecutive days with a fabricated story about a conference that didn't exist. He'd spent that time at a lakeside cabin with his project manager, engaging in the affair I'd been documenting for months. And now he stood in our hallway framing his return as some magnanimous gesture I should receive with gratitude. For a fraction of a second, I felt the deeply ingrained urge to accommodate, to smooth over tension, to prioritize his comfort over my own reality. That impulse had been trained into me through years of partnership where maintaining peace had gradually become more important than maintaining truth. But the weight of the envelope in my hands anchored me to the strategy Vivian and I had constructed. "You're right," I said, keeping my voice level and emotionless. "Thank you for coming home. But this isn't your home anymore." I extended the yellow envelope toward him, holding it in the space between us like a physical border marking territory he no longer had permission to cross. "Your early severance package. Everything you need to know is inside." Silas took the envelope with the confidence of someone who still fundamentally believed he controlled the narrative of our relationship. He tore it open without particular care, the same casual dismissiveness he might apply to opening routine mail, and began scanning the first page. I watched his face transform in real time, a masterclass in the physical manifestation of dawning comprehension. Confusion appeared first as his eyes moved across the legal language of the divorce petition Vivian had filed. Then comprehension as he turned to the second page and encountered the first of Marcus's photographs showing him and Jennifer at the lakeside cabin. Disbelief flickered across his features as he continued flipping through pages that documented his affair with timestamps, geotagged locations and financial records. His hands began trembling visibly around page 4, which contained credit card statements with highlighted charges for hotel rooms, restaurant dinners and the cabin rental. By the time he reached page 7, Vivian's comprehensive financial analysis calculating the $12,000 he'd dissipated on his affair, all color had drained from his face. "What is this?" The question emerged as barely more than a whisper, his voice cracking midway through. "You can't just, this isn't legal. You can't lock me out of my own home." I leaned against the doorframe, maintaining the careful composure I'd practiced mentally for weeks. "Actually, this condominium is in my name exclusively. The lease I signed, the mortgage I'm currently assuming to buy out the building's equity, the security deposit I paid using my inheritance. All mine. You've been living here as my guest for the past 3 years, though I'll admit that legal distinction felt irrelevant when we were actually functioning as married partners. Past tense, as you'll note from the documentation." I watched him process this information, observed the precise moment when he realized I'd been strategizing comprehensively while he'd been focused exclusively on managing his affair logistics and assuming I'd remain conveniently oblivious. He attempted denial first, a predictable initial defense mechanism. "This evidence is circumstantial. Those photographs could be explained as work-related or..." "Page 5, I interrupted calmly, not allowing him to construct alternative narratives. "Timestamps, geotagged locations, credit card receipts creating an irrefutable timeline." Marcus was extremely thorough. "The cabin rental agreement is also included, signed in your name, charged to our joint account." His denial crumbled quickly, replaced by the equally predictable blame strategy. "You've been emotionally cold and distant for months, Eliza. Constantly prioritizing your consulting work over our relationship. Jennifer just understood me in ways you apparently stopped trying to. She actually listened when I talked about my projects instead of treating my career like background noise to your own ambitions." I let him complete the entire accusation without interruption, recognizing it as the standard script of someone attempting to redistribute responsibility for choices they'd made unilaterally. When he finally fell silent, I responded with the clarity I'd developed over weeks of processing his betrayal. "You chose to pursue an affair instead of initiating an honest conversation about relationship dissatisfaction. You chose to construct elaborate lies instead of leaving with integrity. You chose to spend $12,000 of our shared money funding that affair while allowing me to subsidize our legitimate household expenses. Every single choice in that sequence was entirely yours. My only choice was determining how to respond to your choices, and I chose documentation over devastation and strategy over suffering." Silas looked down at the papers again, then back up at me, searching desperately for the version of me who used to accommodate his moods, who used to pursue him for closure when he withdrew emotionally, who used to absorb his dissatisfaction and work to fix problems he'd never clearly articulated. That woman no longer existed in any form he could access or manipulate. "Where am I supposed to go?" he asked, his voice now stripped of the earlier arrogance, reduced to something smaller and more uncertain. "That's an excellent question you should have considered before